Hi, today we'll learn how to emulate private access for variables and methods in JavaScript. If you see an example of other languages like Java, where we can create our own private methods and private members, and which we can access only within the methods of that particular class. We cannot access private methods or private members from outside of this class. The same, but in the JavaScript, there is no predefined or a native way of providing this private access to the variables or the methods. But we can achieve this through the concept of a closure. We can emulate the private access to the variables and the methods by using the closure. Let's see an example. Yeah, this is a simple example of how we can achieve or how we can emulate a private restriction of the variables and the methods through closure. So here in this example, and you have a function called, you have an object or the function called a counter, and it has a local variable, a counter value, and and it is returning a function get counter. Now from the outside of this counter object, the counter function, you cannot access the variable counter val because it is local to the scope of the counter function. But if you want to if you want to get the value of the counter val, you can get it by using by calling the method get counter. Here it returns the counter value. So this is a simple example, but the same when it comes to whether like manipulating the counter value, incrementing or decrementing, or doing some operations on the counter val, we can write, which can be achieved through the closure functions. Let's go ahead and implement. Okay, so let's take an of counters. I'm taking the same example, and let's take a variable var counter val equal to 0, and let's try to call this method console.log of counter. Okay, currently it is not like we didn't write the implement or define this method fully, but let's define it, what we want to achieve. So basically we want to access the value of this counter val from outside. Then let's write a closure function, in a function get counter, and it should return the value of a counter val, and yeah, so now this will return you the reference of get counter, and now you can call this method by using get counter. Okay, and basically the syntax, like if you observe, the syntax looks like the factory way of creating an object in the JavaScript. Okay, now let's go ahead and check what it prints out. No typo here. Okay, so now it printed a 0, that is nothing but the counter value. Now let's go ahead and define other manipulation methods for this. Basically, like I want to increment the counter value. Increment counter, and sorry. And let's just increment the counter value by 1. And for the better readability, let's take this outside and save it in a variable counter object. And now whatever the methods you want to access, and you can simply call this with the object counter object and console.log, and what we want is counter object dot, and now let's call the increment counter, and the expectation is it should increment the counter value by 1, and I missed the comma here because it's an object notation. So yeah, now let's check what is the counter value after calling the increment counter. So let's print the get counter value again. So now this is the counter value before we are incrementing it, and this is the counter value after we incremented the count. Yeah, see, you can observe that 0 and 1. So that is what we are expecting the result. This is how you can manipulate the data of your the private data of your object. This is somewhat like if you this resembles the oops concepts, like where the class will be having a member variables, and the member variables nothing but the data, the methods of the class can access on the the data of the object. So this is a simple example, and you can try writing one more method, one more closer method, decrement counter. If you observe, this is one closer and this is one closer, and all these closer functions of the counter will share the lexical environment where the counter val is defined. This is about the providing the private access to the counter val. Now let's check with the how can we provide the private access to the method. So now let's try creating one more method, function. Like this method I'm defining in the scope of the counter so that it will be accessible to the closer functions get counter and increment counter, because these will be in the same lexical environment of the counter. Function manipulate data, and this is and let's write what we can do. Maybe let's just check let's increment by let's do the incrementation here, incrementing the value here. Let's move this value to here, and here just call this method. Now again, this method is a private local scope to the counter, and you cannot call this manipulate data outside the counter object. Okay, manipulate data, and okay, now the same increment counter you are calling outside, and which calls the private method manipulate data, and which does the incrementation of the counter value by 1. Let's check. Same thing, it prints out the same. Basically, earlier also we are trying to directly manipulate the data by using the increment counter, which is a public function, the closer function, and which will be having the public scope, and you can call with the object counter object. But now we moved the logic of incrementing the value of counter to a private method of this counter, and we are doing the incrementation there. And the outside the you can call to this public method, the public API method increment counter, and then which does in turn call to the private method manipulate data and performs the incrementation of the count. This is how we can achieve the restricting the access to the methods and variables of the object. And it is very important and useful. It's not just restricting the access to the variables from the outside world. It also gives you what we see, when data abstraction kind of thing. It is the method logic or the variable maintenance of the methods will be easier when you make them as a private. I hope you understood the concept. Now you're good with the closer how to emulate the behavior of a private access in JavaScript. Thank you.